but I think like something that ties all of them together is that we are, in essence, one species living on one planet, right? Like, so it, at the end of the day, like the living well part, like however you want to define it, does continue, that it does like contain the idea that we want to continue to live well, right? Like on this planet. And again, to tie it back kind of like what I study and what I think like most people kind of understand right now is that the future is just a bit uncertain right now, right? Like even from a business perspective, like there is not a lot of long-term like thought processes happening about like what is the second half of the 20th century, 21st century look like to us right now, because the first 24 years of the century so far have been very up and down, right? For in a lot of perspectives and for a lot of reasons. And so like what kind of like led me into this program initially was a road trip that I took around the country, where I just kind of saw the decay and like the progression of climate change that is kind of just manifesting itself everywhere you go. And then I discovered this program and this kind of academic movement. I mean, philosophy, like it gets defined many different ways, but essentially it finds that economic growth and like the relentless pursuit of it is at the heart of all of these problems right now, because businesses don't fully encompass the scale, the costs that are involved, because like when all you're shooting for is profits, you try to, you know, externalize as many costs as you possibly can, to the point where like you don't even realize, you can't even quantify the costs at this point. And so there's been this kind of like resurgence of thought and studies in the ecological realm as well as the economic realm, and then in the social realm, that is kind of like weaving together these different theories and ideas, that because we kind of know the past to understand the future, or to understand the present to then predict the future. Right. And so bringing together an understanding of the problem being that economic growth is just driving material extraction, and if all we're caring about at the end of the day is profits, it's leading to buildup of, you know, pollution as well as massive inequality, rising, you know, oceans, like what there's a whole laundry list of things that it's causing, right? And then the issue is that within capitalism, like a hurricane wiping out New Orleans causes economic growth, because then we just spend more to rebuild, which is not necessarily a problem underneath the system, right? So what we look at in the degrowth program is kind of just like different solutions and different ways forward, given what we know of like how business like currently operates versus how it could operate. And another part that is big and it's growing and it's been there forever is just the process of like colonialism, and how deeply rooted it is in like every fabric, like every strain of fabric within our lives right now. So specifically, like this class, Decolonizing Economics, looks at how few voices have been kind of championed, other than, you know, rich white men, right? In general, right? Like I'm sure you've encountered that in everything that you've learned and study and teach. Like it's kind of interesting to just think about how like we've just kind of taken all this for granted, because I think most people don't even really truly comprehend economics, where it's kind of almost made to be obtuse in a way, to where people just like, be like, okay, well, you know, I don't understand the workings of it all, because there's a lot of equations, there's a lot of math, and in reality, it's actually pretty simple, right? At the end of the day, like economics is a closed system, right? Where you take your materials, you transform them into a product, and then they have value for the people, and all of that is like almost a 1 = 1 kind of situation. The problem is that when you're not fully including all of the factors that go into one side of that equation, you get a huge imbalance there. Right? So it's something that like I feel like needs to really be addressed specifically here in this country, because the European center of thought is very much like you're from Poland, you're based in Poland, like you've had a lot of experience outside of this country. The European model right now knows that like growth is not going to be able to continue on perpetually. So they're already actively engaging in this discussion of like what comes next. Capitalism isn't going to just continue on. And what the question like becomes like, what does that look like from like a U.S. perspective?
Well, I mean, there's just so much substance in everything you said. I'm trying to even think where to start, but maybe I'll start with what you ended with, right? The European model, and certainly that thinking about everything you just said. There are countries and groups of countries that are a lot more quicker to shift their focus to that and away from that sort of pure, profit growth driven capitalism. I actually have family in Sweden, and so my family, like my dad and a number of other people, travel there all the time. I don't go as often as I probably should, but it's interesting to hear them talk about the differences between even Sweden and Poland, which are, there was no Baltic Sea, they're actually neighboring countries, right? So the geographic proximity is right there. But in Sweden, everything right now is supposed to be, first of all, organic, second of all, sustainable, and so on. If there is something that's going on that's not sustainable, meaning that we're not, depleting more than we are creating, then the government takes a look at it, and there are sanctions and so on. Holland's another country that is pushing towards green energy, and by, I can't remember what year, it's supposed to be all green, right?
I think in the next decade.
Yeah, something like that. There are, big car companies like Volkswagen, right, that said that within the next 15 or so, 10, 15 years, all of their cars are going to be electric, right? So there's that movement that's much more serious, perhaps, or like I said, some countries are just quicker to make that shift and restructure their entire economy, their legislative system, and what goes with that, of course, the social perception of the benefits of that, right? So that's one thing. I think if the European Union and perhaps some other regions around the world, although right now it's hard to think that somebody would have that as the focus of their political and economic activity as a country, as a government, but we never know, perhaps, right?
A lot of countries still need to develop.
Right. And the more countries we have, the bigger contingent in the world economy countries like that take up, the more, if you will, forced the U.S. is going to be to cooperate with those countries, right? The U.S. economy is very much based on internationalization, on globalization, on international trade. Without it, we wouldn't be the economy that we are. But that's something that you mentioned, that most people don't really understand economics, and I think that's true, unfortunately, and that's sort of to some extent our fault as educators. that there is a lack of understanding. And to me, that lack of understanding means that people are more easily convinced by simple rhetoric that emphasizes certain things and withholds other pieces of information, right?
Right.
Just to make a point, to make a political point, and to gain followership, and that's very unfortunate. I think, in fact, perhaps, if I may risk a statement, that I think that's the biggest problem with the lack of understanding economics right now, is that ease with which you can manipulate information to influence political decisions. Because anybody who does have even a very rudimentary understanding of economics is going to be able to call out, the politicians that are saying just a bunch of, BS that
Yeah.
a lot of people will just buy because it sounds like something that makes sense, right?
It's emotional and it's
of course,
and it's the fear centers of our brain,
and it preys on certain economic inequalities and so on, right? But we all know that, people who perhaps have a bit more understanding of these relationships know that. So it's important to know that the U.S. economy and the well-being of the American economy relies very heavily on being able to trade and cooperate in business with other countries. So, having said that, and sort of maybe agreeing on that point, right? If there are more countries around the world that operate in more sustainable ways, like Scandinavian countries, like many countries in the European Union, which is a huge business partner to the U.S. More and more often, these requirements for sustainability are going to be at the forefront of business contracts between European companies and, let's say, American companies, right? So it'll be in the best interest of the United States and the government and its businesses to start taking a much more closer look at sustainability and whatever other terms there are that are probably a lot more sort of current than sustainability, right? Sustainability's been around forever, but it's like
it's
dynamic
kind of
and
co-opted.
Right, yeah. So, but so that's that's the optimist in me speaking, right?
Sure.
When I say that when the U.S. government and business faces requirements from, let's say, the European Union, saying, well, unless you change the way you do business, unless you refocus, unless you operate in ways that are more resemblant of what we're trying to achieve and promote, we're not going to be able to do business with you because it's going to be illegal for us because of the European Union legislation, right? And that's going to be that turning point, right, where American companies are going to be like, okay, well, in that case, I'm either out of business or I have to go do my business in some other region of the world where they don't really care as much as these darn Europeans do about sustainability, or I have to change my ways, right, and my thinking, and I have to incorporate some of those processes into my operations, which is going to raise my cost, of course. But again, you go to Sweden, where everything is operating under that assumption right now, and shit's expensive. I mean, it's more expensive than, Sweden, Norway, some of the most expensive countries in the world right now. And it's because of that, right?
Yeah.
But they just won't take no for an answer.
And they also maintain high standards of living for all of their citizens.
Yeah.
And I really like...
So that's the optimistic view, right? I mean, I would love for that to happen, but whether it's going to...
I mean, something's going to give one way or another.
Right.
I mean, it's a dynamic world that we live in, and it's ever-changing, even though everyone seems to think and, live with this, false comfort in their brains that, everything stays the same.
Right.
When in reality, nothing stays the same.
Yeah.
I think my biggest issue with those countries is just that, their carbon footprints are, out of control, just like ours are as well. So, they maintain, high social welfare,
Sure.
but at the expense of the ecological and on that side too. So again, like it just brings me back to like what I actually study is that like we need to do less, right? We just like business. The point of like business isn't to just start a business and grow. Like if you don't need to not everybody can't start a business, right? Like we have the American dream that like we've kind of built up in everyone's imaginations, which is that anyone can come here, or can even not even in this country. You can do this anywhere. It's the idea of like your self-starter, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Where if you just have that idea and you just work hard at it, then you can achieve everything you want in this world, right? And like the sad fact is that would require an intense amount of extraction, right? Like resources, and like we live on a finite planet, so just everyone can't do that. Like at the end of the day, so like okay, given that, what are the options here? And the options are that, you know, if you have the basics of living taken care of and subsidized by, you know, if you have a government, like ultimately the government should be working to improve all of the interests and well-being of its citizens, however you want to, you know, box that in. And that's where a government like such as the United States government could actually like provide high standards of living for every single person in this country, regardless of whether or not, if they have the American dream, like if they have the idea, like if they have, like you could just sit on your ass at home and like we did during the pandemic, and the government could pay you to just live and not leave your house, like because that was the concern there. It was just like, we don't want people out mingling around, so just stay at home, we'll pay you, and you got your basics covered right there, right? And you know, I was fortunate enough to hop on Medicaid at that time, and I have since had free health insurance since 2020. Like it's not impossible for like the government to provide that here. Like, and that's honestly like I think the direction that we should be moving. Whereas the political narratives kind of spin it obviously in the other way, being like, you know, I'm just, you know, feeding off of the system. I'm just mooching. I'm just like being lazy and unproductive, and like that's like the idea of productivity is something that I think we need to rethink in terms of the idea that like being productive means contributing to the economy. And at the end of the day, if we want to make a transition away from capitalism and constant growth, we have to become more comfortable with the idea of being unproductive, and that it's not a stigma, it's not a stereotype, and that's a good way to lower emissions, like at the end of the day, right? Like, so if we want to solve the climate change problem, or at least, you know, mitigate it at this point, we have to like not continually to climb up and up. We have to sort of like level off. They have like, they talk about the S graph, right? Like you have the L graph, which is like the constant growth, like up into the you know the center of the universe, or whatever happens after you leave the planet. Or you have, you know, you start slow, you have your period of growth, and then you level off, right? And that's kind of the principle of steady state economics, which is part of degrowth. There's a lot of debate. Like again, there's no definitive answer to any of these questions. Like these are just alternate theories.
No, and I mean, you know, I think thinking about, you know, these ideas, these options, might lead to something that sort of initiates that change, right? Because it's all going to be a chain reaction, like it always is in economics, right? But I know what some of these like old school hardcore economists are going to say to some of these options, right? Like the option that you were describing, right? That's one way, but some of the old timers, or you know, economists, I suppose in general, who are
it's called mainstream economics.
Yeah, mainstream. There we go. Yeah. Or would say that, okay, well, but then who's going to, you know, if there are some people who are going to be paid for not doing much, so that we can degrow, so that we can reduce the emissions and not be so harmful to the environment as humanity in general, right? Then who are going to be the people that are going to finance that, right? Like the government does have to have some source of income to be able to cover that expense, right? To fund that, relatively comfortable living for everybody. But it's not going to come out of nowhere, right? That revenue has to be generated somewhere. So how do we decide who gets to sit on their ass and do nothing and get paid for it versus who has to work their ass off to provide for these other folks, right? So that's the classic counter argument, right?
Right.
And so, but I still think, and but part of me who's like classically trained in these ideas says that there has to be something that's going on in the world that generates revenue. But even if something like that were possible, right, then who makes these decisions? How are these decisions made? Who finances the whole thing? And so that's one thing, right? But another thing is just this tremendous overhaul of
the system.
The system and just the social perception of the whole thing.
Right.
We would literally, most people around the planet would have to abandon any sort of ambition related to our economic well-being, right? Family well-being. That oftentimes just comes down to being able to have the lifestyle that you want and pay for it, right? So I think, and this is me kind of being Isaac Asimov now, like just totally like reaching out to the sci-fi realm, right?
No, I mean that's how we.
Yeah, and so like
build
yeah, and so like how do we change that? How do we change at least
Public
most
perception.
people's public perception of what it means to be happy, what it means to be, to have a fulfilled life, right? And how do we make most people abandon these ambitions for growth, for development, for personal success, and so on? How do we redefine the success in a way that people buy into it, right? And this is me reaching to the sci-fi realm. I don't know, maybe I'm overly skeptical, but I think short of some huge cataclysm on a atomic scale, like Earth predicted to be hit by a meteor that will destroy life as we know it, unless we all pull together as humanity all over the planet, pull our resources together and do something about it, which is a subject of many a sci-fi book and movie, right? Exactly. So how do we
how do we manufacture that?
Yeah. What's that most recent fad, the 3-body problem books, right? Like where we know that shit's gonna go down, we don't know exactly what it's gonna be, but unless we pull together as humanity and abandon all of the ambitions that were defining our lives and our sort of progress and the drive to career and work and education, then we're all gonna be dead in however many years, right? So like how do we do that without that doom and gloom thought of a cataclysm?
Well, I want to circle back to a couple things that you were talking about. How do we change the social perception, because there's just been such a heavy amount of propaganda that has filtered down through the capitalist machine over the last half century or more, that literally like everyone assumes that GDP and economic growth are normal and have been around forever, when in fact they've only been around since World War II.
Right.
Like it's such a new idea.
Right.
But part of what I'm like actively working on, and part of like what this conversation actually is just that. Like it requires people having conversations with controversial topics and like getting into like a bit of an uncomfortable space where it's like, yeah, we're talking about climate change and the potential end of the world, and you know what? That needs to be a conversation that we don't shy away from anymore, right? There's also, like you said, like sci-fi. Like there's the idea of like creating artistic like envisionings of our imaginaries of like other ways that we could do it. I mean, you go back to the beginning of the sci-fi era and you find all sorts of stories and subjects that of essentially civilizations outside of capitalism.
Right.
And that's where Roddenberry, that's where Asimov, Herbert, like
Sure.
with Dune, like they're like a lot of what they're doing, specifically like with Dune, like coming out right now, like the Fremen, like are the society that as living outside of capitalism, they've created this thriving society that the capitalists, you know, Harkonnen and the Imperial, like don't even know exists. And they're, if you read the books, they're on the verge of like building like a sort of utopia on a desert planet and like terraforming it, essentially making it livable and like rewilding it. And so I think that like our imaginaries, conversations, and like creating art, because that's essentially what sci-fi is, is it all builds our it changes our common senses, right? Like where we have this like perception of how things are, and we think about like, oh well, maybe it could be this way, and then that causes us to kind of move in that direction a little bit. Obviously it doesn't end up exactly that way, but it starts to build that out a little bit. To bring it back to something much more practical in terms of like how do you pay for an eco-social transition, it requires allowing more voices into this conversation other than the old white mainstream economists. Because, I mean, specifically the theory that is fairly popular like in my spaces is the modern monetary theory, which is a completely different way of looking at what a sovereign government can do. And essentially the common perception and one of the like the myths that they correct is that the government doesn't need money first. It doesn't need to tax to spend. It spends and then it taxes. And anything it doesn't take back from taxes becomes the deficit and essentially was spent towards something productive, redefining that word, within the society, right? Because you're building hospitals, you're building schools, you're building infrastructure, you're building mass transit, you're building like walkable and bikeable cities. That's theoretically what the deficit should be, right? And like the deficit doesn't, as long as it's all being held in the same denomination of currency of that government, it doesn't ever have to be paid back. That's one of the major like narratives that circles this country is that like, oh, our deficit is, you know, climbing. It's like it goes up. I think right now the number is like $1 trillion every couple months or something right now. Most of that is war right now. Most of that is like war spending. But like the certain, you know, political figures and pundits will use that as a narrative to be like, well, we need to get our checkbooks in order, we need to balance our sheets, we need to cut social spending. It's because that's the first thing they do is they cut services from the lowest end of the spectrum. And like,
education for that.
Or education. Great, right. We could jump into that conversation and talk about how the thought leaders and the influencers that are educators like are just being kicked to the curb left and right. But the point is that like there are answers out there. There are solutions to these problems. And it's more just about, again, getting people to engage in the political. Because right now in this world we have this perception, specifically in this country, that like, what are the 3 things we don't talk about at the dinner table? Sex, religion, and politics. And at the end of the day, everything is political. Every aspect of our world, every decision we make or allow someone else to make for us is a political decision.